Where's your thing, boy? The words ripped through the quiet dawn like a bullet. Caleb Morgan's voice was raw, guttural, shocked. He had followed the sound of water to the river bend, expecting solitude. Instead, he found his newest ranch hand, Jessie Hale, stripped bare, revealing a secret that could ruin them both. Jessie wasn't a boy at all. She was a woman, hidden beneath hats and flannel, risking everything just to survive. In a land where the frontier chewed women alive without protection, deception was her only weapon. But Caleb's world was built on trust, and truth and betrayal cut him deep. Follow my story to the end and comment the city you are watching so I can see how far my story has gone. The river was still in the early morning, a silver ribbon twisting through cottonwoods, its surface broken only by the ripple of trout and the soft splash of boots on the shallows. Caleb Morgan dismounted slowly, his horse stamping nervously at the unfamiliar scent of water. He often came here to be alone, to let the rush of the current wash the silence from his bones. But this morning something else drew his eyes, a flicker of movement through the willows. He froze. His hand brushed the worn grip of the Colt on his hip, instincts rising sharp. The frontier bred suspicion, the way the sun baked dust into the land. And Caleb had learned long ago never to ignore that prickle in his gut. He stepped forward, boots crunching softly against the earth, every sense alert. Then he saw it. A figure standing in the shallow's water, swirling about lean legs. Jessie Hale. His new hand. Quiet, efficient, secretive. Always in a hat too wide, shirts buttoned high, even in the heat sleeves rolled down as though hiding from the sun. Caleb had studied Jessie from afar for weeks. Something about the boy had unsettled him. But what he saw now, what made his breath stick in his chest, was a revelation that left him staggered. Jessie's hat lay discarded on a rock. Her hair, dark and wet, clung to her shoulders in heavy strands. And her shirt, always fastened, always guarded, was gone. In its place was smooth skin pale against the cold river, delicate, feminine, undeniably not the body of the boy he'd thought he knew. The words tore from him before he could leash them. "Where's your thing, boy?" His voice was hoarse, booming across the canyon walls. Jessie spun her eyes wide, her face flaming red with shock and fear. For the first time since arriving at the ranch, she looked small, fragile, though the fury in her gaze burned hot. "Caleb," she stammered, clutching for the wet shirt, dragging it against her chest, as though it could undo what he'd seen. "Please listen." But Caleb wasn't listening. He was charging forward, boots throwing up gravel, his jaw clenched so tight it felt carved from stone. Betrayal roared through him. A woman. All this time, a woman had been living under his roof, eating at his table, working his land. And she'd lied. Lied to his face, lied to every man who trusted her, shoulder to shoulder on the range. "What game are you playing?" His voice was thunder. "You come onto my ranch claiming to be a man taking pay from my pocket." "God almighty, Jessie, do you take me for a fool?" She pulled the shirt over her shoulders, fumbling with trembling fingers. Her wet hair plastered to her cheeks. Her chin lifted despite the fear trembling in her body. "It's no game," she said, her voice raw. "It's survival." Caleb stopped short, fists clenched, chest heaving. Her words cut sharper than he wanted them to. Survival. In this country, that word meant more than excuses. It meant life or death. Jessie drew a ragged breath. "What was I supposed to do? Ride into your ranch dressed as a woman, asking for work, alone with no family, no protection? I'd be laughed at, or worse. No man hires a woman for ranch work. Not here, not now. If I wanted a chance to live, I had to lie." Her voice cracked, and for the first time Caleb saw the desperation beneath the disguise. She wasn't trying to trick him for gain. She was trying to exist. Still, the fury inside him clawed at his chest. "You lied to me," he growled. "You made me trust you. What choice did I have?" She shot back, her eyes flashing. "If I walked into town as Jessie Hale, woman alone, I'd have been taken, used, discarded. That's the world we live in, Caleb. Don't stand there preaching about trust when a woman's got no chance of earning it honestly." The air between them burned hotter than the noonday sun. Caleb wanted to turn away, to shake the betrayal off like dust. But he couldn't. He couldn't stop looking at her, the stubborn lift of her chin, the wet hair clinging to her neck, the way she trembled not from cold, but from defiance. She was a lie. But she was also alive with a courage he couldn't ignore. For a long moment, neither spoke. The river whispered over stones, a hawk screeched high above the silence, stretching taut as wire. Finally, Caleb dragged a hand over his face, trying to find words that wouldn't come out as rage. "Why here?" he asked hoarsely. "Why my ranch?" Jessie's eyes dropped to the water, her voice softening. "Because I was running. Because I needed to disappear. There's a man, Grant Tiller. He wanted me, owned me in his mind. I fled before he could. He's dangerous, cruel. I didn't know where else to go." Caleb's stomach tightened at the name. He didn't know Tiller, but he knew the type men who thought women were possessions, the kind of men who left scars deeper than a whip. Jessie looked up again, her eyes wet with more than river water. "I didn't want to fool you, Caleb. I wanted to live. That's all." Her words hit him like a hammer, and in that moment his anger faltered. He still felt the sting of betrayal, yes, but beneath it something older stirred, something he thought he'd buried with his wife, a need to protect, to stand between someone and the cruelty of the world. He hated that he felt it, hated that the lie she'd lived now forced him to feel again. But the truth stared him in the face, as plain as her dripping hair. She had lied, but maybe the lie had saved her life. The Colt at his side felt heavy. His code, his unbending sense of right, demanded she leave. But his heart, silent for years, whispered something he wasn't ready to admit. "You'll ride back to the ranch," he said finally, his voice low, hard. "You'll work today. Tonight, we'll talk again. But mark me, Jessie." He looked her square in the eyes, steel to steel. "If I find one more lie hiding under your hat, I'll send you packin' before dawn." Jessie nodded slowly, her hands still trembling as she clutched the shirt around her. But there was a glimmer in her eyes now, not relief, not quite, something fiercer. She'd been caught, but she wasn't broken. Caleb turned back toward his horse, jaw set, the weight of what he'd discovered pressing against every breath. The river behind him whispered secrets he couldn't silence. Ahead lay a ranch that no longer felt steady beneath his boots. And beside him, walking quietly back through the willows, was a woman who had lied her way into his world and might change it forever. The sun had just begun its climb over the ridges when Caleb and Jessie rode back toward the ranch yard. The silence between them was a living thing, thick and heavy, stretching across the space like barbed wire. Caleb kept his eyes forward, reins held firm in one hand, the other resting idly near his holster. Jessie trailed half a horse's length behind shoulders squared as though bracing herself for a storm that hadn't yet broken. To the ranch hands, their return looked ordinary enough, boss and boy coming back from a morning ride, but to Caleb everything was altered. Every hoofbeat echoed the memory of the river of hair clinging to wet shoulders of a lie, wrapped in flannel and work boots. He dismounted in the yard with practiced ease, tossing the reins to a young hand who hurried over. His voice carried its usual command. "Get her rubbed down." No one would hear the crack beneath it, the tension coiled in his gut. Jessie slid down from her saddle, her movements stiff, deliberate. She adjusted her hat, a wide-brimmed shield she had snatched back on before they left the river, and pulled the brim low. For a moment their eyes met. Hers carried defiance, but also a flicker of gratitude, as though she hadn't expected to be allowed to ride back at all. Caleb turned away first. The day unfolded as any other cattle, to check fences, to mend supplies, to track, but the rhythm of the ranch had shifted. Caleb watched Jessie from the corner of his eye. Her motions, once invisible in their efficiency, now carried a strange gravity. Every swing of the hammer, every tug at a rope, seemed sharper, more deliberate, as though she knew she worked under a microscope. And maybe she did. Caleb tried to lose himself in labor. He drove nails into weathered posts, checked the water troughs, barked orders with his usual sternness. But his mind betrayed him. It drifted back unbidden to the curve of Jessie's shoulders in the river light, to the fire in her eyes when she'd snapped. What choice did I have? He hated that her words rang true. Out here, a woman had no place without a man's name to shield her. Work was scarce, danger plentiful. Alone she'd have been swallowed whole by wolves in men's skin. He knew it, and still the betrayal gnawed at him. By sundown, the yard buzzed with its evening rhythm. Men returned from the range, voices, loud laughter rising around the fire pit where cards and whiskey soothed the day's fatigue. Jessie, as always, kept apart, her plate balanced on her knees beneath the shadow of the bunkhouse lean-to. Hank Dobbs sat near the fire, his lined face lit by flame, his tobacco-stained teeth flashing as he muttered to Jed about the new hand. Caleb caught only fragments quiet as a tombstone, always hiding under that hat. Not natural, I tell you. He forced himself not to respond. He had no proof not yet that Hank's suspicion could turn into poison. But Hank had been his right hand for near 2 decades, and jealousy had a way of sharpening suspicion into a blade. Caleb's jaw worked as he retreated to the porch of the main house. He lit a lantern, letting its glow cast a circle against the dark. He leaned back in his chair, staring out at the ranch yard. The laughter of his men should have been comforting the hum of routine that kept his world steady. But tonight the harmony was cracked. He saw Jessie at the edge of the light, hunched over her plate, isolated by choice or by necessity. He saw Hank watching her with narrowed eyes, chewing like a man gnawing a grudge. His late wife Sarah would have known what to say. She had always seen through masks, had always known how to coax truth with kindness. But Sarah was gone, taken by fever, and Caleb had built walls high enough to keep grief and tenderness both at bay. Until now. Jessie shifted slightly, lifting her face toward the porch light. For the first time, Caleb wondered not what lies she had told, but what pain had driven her to tell it. Later, long after the fire had burned down and most of the men had stumbled to their bunks, Caleb found himself pacing the main room of the house. The lantern threw restless shadows against the walls, shadows that seemed to whisper the questions he couldn't silence. He poured himself a measure of whiskey, the amber liquid catching the light. He drank not for pleasure, but for clarity, for the heat that burned down to his core and kept him steady. The question gnawed. Had he been a fool to let her stay even for a day more? Was he risking his ranch, his men, his very name for the sake of one woman's desperate gamble? The floorboards creaked. He turned sharply. Jessie stood at the doorway, hat in her hands, eyes dark pools in the dim light. "You said we'd talk?" she said quietly. Caleb gestured stiffly to the chair across from him. She sat, shoulders rigid, her hands knotted around the brim of her hat. For a long moment, neither spoke. The only sound was the crackle of the lantern and the faint whistle of wind through the eaves. Finally, Caleb leaned forward, elbows braced on his knees. His voice was low, gravel-edged. "I run this ranch on trust, Jessie. A man breaks it, he's out before the dust settles." "What you did?" He shook his head, words failing. "I don't abide lies." Jessie swallowed, her gaze steady. "Then send me packin' now, but hear me first." Her voice didn't tremble. It was the voice of someone who had lived too long on the edge of fear to waste time on pleading. She told him of the trail she'd ridden, of the men who'd tried to corner her in towns where she stopped, of Grant Tiller's relentless pursuit. She spoke of hunger, of nights sleeping in barns, of the moment she realized no one would hire her as Jessie Hale. "So I cut my hair." She finished, running a hand through the strands that had grown long again. "I bound myself in cloth, lowered my voice, and prayed no one looked too close. And it worked until today." Her eyes searched his. "I didn't lie for gain, Caleb. I lied to breathe another day." Caleb sat back slowly, the weight of her words pressing down. He saw the truth in her face, raw and unvarnished. It didn't erase the anger, but it shifted it. Anger at her deception gave way to anger at the world that had forced it. "You're playing a dangerous game," he muttered. Jessie's lips twisted into something not quite a smile. "I didn't have a choice. The game chose me." The silence between them stretched again, but it felt different now, less hostile, more like 2 weathered souls circling the same fire. Caleb rubbed a hand over his beard, sighing. "You'll work tomorrow, same as any man here, but if Hank or any of the others catch wind, I'll handle it." Jessie cut in. Her voice was steady, but her hands still clenched the brim of her hat until the knuckles shone white. Caleb studied her a long time, then gave a slow nod. "We'll see." Outside, the prairie wind howled like a restless spirit, carrying with it the promise of change neither of them yet understood. Morning light spilled across the Morgan ranch like liquid fire, painting the hills gold and throwing long shadows across the yard. The roosters crowed, horses stomped impatiently in their stalls, and the ranch hands stirred from their bunks groggy but ready for another long day of work. To any passerby, it was an ordinary dawn in the Wyoming territory. But to Caleb Morgan, Nothing was ordinary anymore. He stood on the porch, coffee steaming in his mug, his eyes fixed on the figure moving across the yard. Jessie Hale. Hat pulled low sleeves buttoned, despite the heat already rising off the earth, she carried her tools with the same quiet purpose she always had. And yet to Caleb, she was a stranger. Not Jessie the boy, but Jessie the woman. The truth sat heavy in his chest, a stone he couldn't dislodge. The men gathered near the corral, Hank Dobbs at their head, grumbling as always. His sharp eyes tracked Jessie with barely concealed suspicion. Hank had worked for Caleb for years, loyal in his way, but restless, quick to judge, and slower to forgive. Boss Hank called spitting tobacco into the dirt. That new hand of yours, he don't act right. Sleeps alone, never takes his hat off. Eats apart from the rest of us. You ever seen the like? Caleb sipped his coffee, offering no reply. He had learned long ago that silence could be sharper than words. But Hank wasn't deterred. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping low enough to carry only to Caleb. I don't trust him. Mark me, something ain't right about Jessie. A man with nothing to say usually got something to hide. Caleb's jaw tightened, though his face gave nothing away. He wasn't ready to admit Hank was right, not about this, not now. If Hank knew the truth, if any of the men knew, the ranch would boil over with gossip before the hour was out. Instead, Caleb's voice came quiet, cold. Long as he works hard, he stays. That's the end of it. Hank's lips twisted, but he backed away, muttering under his breath. Caleb watched him go, unease gnawing at his gut. Hank was a problem he couldn't ignore forever. Jessie worked with her usual diligence, hammering new planks into a section of fence the cattle had splintered days before. Sweat dampened her shirt, and the sun caught on the strands of hair she'd hastily tucked beneath her hat. Caleb found himself watching her too long, noting the way her hands, smaller, finer than a man's, moved with precision, the grace that had always set her apart. He cursed under his breath and turned away. He had no business noticing such things. She was a liar, a fugitive, a woman who had deceived him under his own roof. But damn if he couldn't push the image of her from his mind, the defiance in her eyes, the tremor in her voice as she confessed, it's survival. By midday, the men drove a small herd toward the branding pen. Dust rose in choking clouds, the lowing of cattle filling the air. Jessie rode alongside Jed, one of the younger hands guiding strays back into line, with sharp whistles and a firm hand on the reins. She rode well better than most, and Caleb knew it wasn't the first herd she'd pushed. Not bad for the quiet one, Jed called, grinning as Jessie steered a stubborn heifer back into place. Jessie nodded once, keeping her eyes on the herd. She didn't smile, didn't answer. She never did. But Hank's glare burned holes into her back. He had noticed the subtle grace of her movements, too, though his mind twisted it into suspicion. A man that fluid, that quiet, that careful, there was something unnatural about it. That evening, when the work was done and the men gathered around the fire, Caleb stood apart as he often did, leaning against a post on the porch. The men's laughter carried across the yard, the snap of cards on a barrel lid, punctuating their easy camaraderie. Jessie sat alone as always at the far edge of the firelight, her plate balanced on her knees. Hank's voice rose above the others. Strange, ain't it, how he keeps to himself? Never joins us for cards, never takes his shirt off even when it's hotter than a blacksmith's forge. What's he hiding, you reckon? The men chuckled a few muttering agreements. Caleb's eyes narrowed. He set his cup down with a hard clink and stepped forward, his boots crunching on gravel. That's enough, he said, voice like iron. The firelight caught his face, his steel-gray eyes pinning Hank in place. He works harder than most of you combined. That's what matters. The laughter died, the men falling silent under their boss's stare. Hank smirked, but the malice in his eyes deepened. Jessie's gaze flicked toward Caleb, then just for a heartbeat. Gratitude softened her features, though she quickly lowered her eyes again. Caleb felt a strange warmth stir in his chest, something protective, something he didn't want to name. Later that night, long after the fire had burned low, Caleb found Jessie by the corral mending a section of rope by lantern light. He approached quietly, his shadow long against the dust. You ought to be sleeping, he said. Jessie glanced up, her face half lit, half hidden. Work don't stop just 'cause the sun's down. Caleb studied her a moment. The men are starting to talk. her hand stilled on the rope. "They'll keep talking. They'll talk louder," he warned. She met his eyes. Then the lantern glow catching the steel in hers. "I can take it." Caleb hesitated. The part of him that demanded order, honesty, clarity, wanted to press harder to demand she tell him everything now. But another part, the part stirred awake by the fire of her will, held him back. Instead, he said, "Keep your head down. Hank's a rattler. He'll strike if he gets the chance." Jessie gave the barest nod, then bent back to her rope, dismissing him with silence. Caleb lingered a moment longer, then turned toward the house, the night air cool on his skin. But long after he lay down, the image of her eyes in the lantern glow haunted him. Fierce, defiant, and unbroken. The secret between them bound them closer than either dared admit, and Caleb knew, with the certainty of a storm brewing on the horizon, that this fragile balance could not last. The days rolled on, but the air around the Morgan Ranch seemed heavier, charged with something unspoken. Caleb felt it pressing against him each time he walked the yard, a current of suspicion and whispered words. Hank Dobbs was the source, and Caleb knew it. Hank had always been quick to sense a shift in the wind, and since Jessie's arrival his nose twitched like a coyote's at every small sign. He saw the way Caleb's eyes lingered on the quiet hand a second too long. He noticed how Jessie's work, efficient and precise, earned Caleb's rare nod of approval, and each time Hank's jaw tightened with resentment. Boss Hank drawled one morning as the men saddled their horses. "Seems like that new hand of yours gets away with a mighty lot. Never joins us for the rough work, always off on some side task. Almost like you're keeping him set apart." Caleb straightened slowly, meeting Hank's gaze. His voice was cool even. "Jessie works harder than most. You'd do well to keep your eyes on your own chores." The warning was clear, but Hank smirked, spitting tobacco into the dust. "Just seems funny is all. Funny how you keep trusting someone you don't know nothing about." Caleb said nothing more, but the words lodged like a burr under his skin. That evening, as the herd was driven back toward the corrals, Caleb found himself watching Jessie again. She rode slightly ahead, her posture straight, her hat pulled low. The grace of her movement struck him, not the clumsy strength of most men, but a controlled, deliberate precision. She guided the cattle with calm authority, her quiet voice steadying even the most stubborn steers. Caleb cursed under his breath and turned his gaze to the horizon. He'd spent years building walls of stone around his heart. Sarah's death had taught him that love was a weakness, the frontier punished mercilessly. Yet now a woman disguised as a man was chiseling cracks in that wall with every day she spent under his roof. That night at supper, Jessie sat alone as she always did. She picked at her food quietly, shoulders hunched against the low rumble of men's conversation. Caleb watched from the head of the table. When one of the younger hands slid his tin plate too close to hers, Jessie stiffened, edging back with a muttered word. Caleb's jaw tightened. She was cornered, whether she admitted it or not. Hank saw it too. His eyes glittered as he leaned toward Jed. "See how he never joins us? See how he keeps away?" A man with nothing to say usually got too much to hide. The whisper wasn't meant for Caleb's ears, but he caught it all the same. He set his fork down with deliberate calm and spoke, his voice carrying across the bunkhouse. "Jesse does his share of work. That's all that matters." The room quieted, all eyes shifting to their boss. Hank forced a laugh, but bitterness edged it. Caleb's word was law on this ranch, but Hank wasn't finished. Later, when the fire burned low, Caleb walked past Jessie's lean-to. She was sitting in the half-light, mending a torn sleeve with needle and thread. Her face was drawn, but her hands were steady. Caleb paused. "You eat enough?" he asked. Jessie looked up, startled, then nodded. "Plenty." "You keep clear of Hank," Caleb said quietly. "He's stirring trouble." Jessie's lips pressed into a thin line. "I can handle men like him." Caleb studied her, the firelight flickering against her face. "Maybe so. But this ain't about just you anymore. When Hank stirs, others listen." Jessie didn't answer. She bent back to her stitching shoulders tight. Caleb lingered a moment, then walked on through the image of her face, defiant, weary, unbroken, followed him into the dark. The frontier had taught him to trust his instincts, and his instincts screamed that the balance of his ranch was shifting. Jessie's secret wasn't safe much longer, and the pull she had on him, silent, steady, undeniable, was only tightening. The morning broke with a restless wind, the kind that bent the prairie grass and whispered of storms yet unseen. Caleb Morgan woke before the sun as always, but today the weight in his chest was heavier. The night before he'd lain awake, the memory of the river scene refusing to release its hold. Jessie Hale, the ranch hand he had taken in without question, was no boy at all. She was a woman hiding beneath flannel and shadows, carving out survival with a lie. He moved through his chores with practiced efficiency, feeding the stock, checking the tack, giving orders in his steady, uncompromising tone. To any watching eye, he was the same Caleb Morgan. He had always been stern, unyielding, a man carved from stone. But inside, his thoughts circled like buzzards. By mid-morning, he spotted Jessie down by the south fence, hammer in hand, driving nails into the warped boards. Her hat shadowed her face, but Caleb didn't need to see her eyes to know she was rattled. Every movement carried a tightness, a caution, as though she felt the walls closing in. He rode over, dismounting with deliberate calm. Jessie stiffened, straightening as though bracing for a blow. "Fence won't hold if you set nails shallow," he said gruffly. Her lips pressed thin. "I know what I'm doing." Caleb watched her a long moment, then leaned against the post. "You lied to me." The hammer stilled in her hand. She didn't look at him, but her voice was low and fierce. "I did what I had to do." His jaw worked, teeth grinding. "You came onto my land under false pretenses, ate at my table, worked beside my men." His voice dropped rough as gravel. "Made me trust you." Her head snapped up, then eyes blazing from beneath the brim of her hat. "And what would you have had me do, Caleb? Walk into town with my hair down, begging for scraps? You think any man would have given me honest work? No. They'd have given me worse. I'd be owning a man's name, or worse, a man's fist before the week was out. I put on a hat and a shirt, lowered my voice, and earned my keep. That's all." The fire in her words stopped him cold. He saw it then, the desperation beneath the disguise, the courage it took to live a lie every day. And damn it, he couldn't deny the truth of what she said. He'd seen what happened to women alone on the frontier. The world was crueler than most men cared to admit. "Grant Tiller," she said, suddenly spitting the name like poison. "He's the reason I ran. He wanted to own me, Caleb. Said I'd be his no matter what I wanted. I left in the dead of night, took his horse, and never looked back." Caleb's face hardened at the name. He didn't know Tiller personally, but he knew the type. A bully, a predator, a man who believed possession and love were the same. Jessie's shoulders sagged, the fire in her eyes dimming into weary defiance. "You think I wanted this, to live as a man, to lie every time I opened my mouth? I didn't. But I wanted to live more than I wanted honesty." The silence stretched long between them. The wind rattled through the fence line, carrying dust across the open plain. Caleb felt the anger ebb, replaced by something he hadn't expected. Understanding. Maybe even respect. "You should have told me," he muttered finally. Her chin lifted. "Would you have let me stay if I had?" The question hung sharp as a blade. Caleb didn't answer because he knew the truth. He wouldn't have. Jessie's lips curved in a bitter, almost smile. "That's what I thought." She bent back to her work, driving the nail home with steady blows. Caleb stood there a moment longer, torn between his code and the strange pull he felt toward her. Finally, he turned and walked back to his horse, the weight in his chest heavier than before. That night, the ranch hands gathered for supper. Jessie kept to her corner as always, but Hank Dobbs's eyes followed her like a hawk's. He nudged Jed with an elbow. "Ever notice how he keeps them sleeves rolled down even in the heat and never takes his hat off? Ain't natural," Jed chuckled uneasily. "Maybe he's just shy." Or maybe, Hank said, lowering his voice, "he ain't what he says he is." Caleb, sitting at the head of the table, heard every word. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing. To speak would be to feed the fire, and he wasn't ready for that blaze. When the meal ended, Caleb stepped outside the night air, cool against his skin. He looked out over the land he'd bled for, the ranch that was his life's work. And in the shadows, he saw Jessie walking toward her lean-to shoulders squared alone against the world. His fists clenched. She had lied to him, yes, but she had also fought to survive in a land that gave women no mercy. And Caleb Morgan, whether he admitted it aloud or not, was a man who couldn't look away from someone fighting alone. The next morning dawned pale and restless, the kind of sky that promised heat by noon and trouble before nightfall. Caleb Morgan saddled his horse in silence, the weight of sleepless hours pressing heavy behind his eyes. He had tossed and turned through the night, wrestling with a truth that refused to leave him. Jessie Hale had lied, but her lie was born of survival, not malice. As he tightened the cinch strap, his mind replayed her words at the fence. "Would you have let me stay if I had told you the truth?" He hated the question because the answer was clear. He wouldn't have. His own code, that rigid wall of honesty and order, would have turned her away at the gate, and that knowledge twisted like a knife in his gut. Out in the yard, the men stirred voices, carrying over the clatter of buckets and the restless shuffle of hooves. Hank Dobbs was louder than usual, his words pitched just high enough to reach Caleb's ears. "Boy's too quiet," Hank muttered to anyone who would listen. "Sleeps apart, eats apart, don't even strip to wash like the rest of us. Mark me, there's something off." A couple of younger hands chuckled nervously, while others kept their eyes low, unwilling to be caught in Hank's fire. But the seed was planted, and Caleb knew it. Gossip was like prairie fire, hard to start, harder to stop. He mounted up his eyes, scanning the yard until they landed on Jessie. She was already at work hauling feed sacks from the barn to the troughs, her slight frame straining under the weight, but refusing to falter. Sweat slicked her brow beneath the brim of her hat. She didn't look up, didn't acknowledge the whispers curling around her. She just kept moving, shoulders squared, jaw tight. Caleb rode past her, forcing his voice steady. "When you're done, check the east fence line." Jessie glanced up briefly, her eyes shadowed, then nodded. "Yes, sir." That "sir" cut deeper than it should have. Formal, distant. She was building her own wall now, one that matched his. By noon, the herd had been pushed into the branding pen. The air thickened with dust, the bawling of cattle, and the clang of irons filling the space. Caleb worked alongside his men, his shirt clinging with sweat, his arms aching with the familiar rhythm of rope and brand. Jessie was there too, her movements sure and efficient, her face set in a mask of determination. But Caleb saw more than efficiency. He saw the flicker of tension each time someone brushed too close the careful angle of her body to shield herself from touch. He saw the courage it took for her to stand shoulder to shoulder with men who would destroy her if they knew. When the last calf bawled and stumbled free, the men broke for water, laughing and swearing in the heat. Jessie retreated to the shade of the corral, pulling her hat lower. Hank's eyes followed her like a hawk's shadow. That evening, after the dust had settled and the men gathered for their nightly fire, Caleb kept to the porch. As usual, arms folded across his chest, Jessie lingered at the edge of the firelight, her plate balanced on her knees, isolated by choice but also by necessity. Hank leaned forward, his voice carrying over the crackle of flames. "Tell me, boss, you ever wonder why he never joins us? Why he never lets his hat slip, even in this heat? I seen men hide things before, and it never ended clean." The laughter around the fire died down. Jed shifted uneasily. The others glanced toward Jessie, then quickly back at Hank. Caleb's voice cut through the night low and sharp. "You got something to say, Hank, say it to me. Otherwise, shut your mouth." Hank smirked, but the malice in his eyes only deepened. He leaned back, spitting into the dirt, and the fire crackled back to life. But Caleb knew the damage was done. The whisper had become a rumor, and soon the rumor would spread beyond the ranch. Later, Caleb found Jessie in the barn, currying down her horse by lantern light. The quiet rasp of the brush against the animal's flank filled the air. She didn't look up when he stepped inside, but her shoulders stiffened. "You ought to rest," he said. She kept brushing her voice tight. "Rest don't change much." Caleb walked closer, the lantern glow painting his face in harsh lines. Hank's stirring trouble. "I know." She set the brush down, turning to face him. Her eyes burned in the dim light. "Let him. I've lived with worse." Caleb studied her, torn between anger and admiration. "You shouldn't have to." Her chin lifted, defiance sharpening her features. "I don't get to choose what I have to, Caleb. I only get to choose whether I keep standing, and I will." The words struck him harder than he cared to admit. For a long moment they stood in silence, the horse shifting quietly between them. Then Caleb reached up, pulling his hat low. "You'll keep standing," he said quietly, "but not alone. Not while you're on my land." Jessie's breath caught just for a heartbeat before she turned away, stroking the horse's mane to hide the flicker in her eyes. Caleb left the barn with his chest tight, the night air cool against his face. He knew the storm was coming, whether in the form of Hank's poison or the shadow of Grant Tiller. And when it broke the fragile balance of his ranch, his men and his own heart would be tested in ways he had long sworn never to allow again. The prairie morning was quiet, but it was the kind of quiet that carried tension like the still air before lightning split the sky. Caleb Morgan felt it in his bones as he walked across the yard, coffee in hand. His boots crunched against hard-packed dirt, and every sound seemed sharper than usual: the clang of a gate, the low whinny of a restless horse, the murmur of men preparing for the day. Jessie Hale moved among them with her usual focus, saddling her mount eyes fixed on the work in front of her. To anyone else, she was still Jessie the boy, silent, competent, a little strange in his reserve. But Caleb saw more. He saw the tension in her shoulders, the way her jaw tightened each time a man's laughter rose near her. He saw the isolation she wrapped around herself like armor. And he saw Hank Dobbs watching her, sharp and hungry. Hank had always been a thorn in his side, but lately the thorn had festered. The man's muttered suspicions had grown bolder, his whispers louder. Around the bunkhouse fire in the barn, even during the day's work, Hank planted seeds of doubt in the men's minds. That hand don't act natural, never strips to wash, never lets his hat slip. You ever see him smile? The comment seemed harmless at first, but Caleb knew the way gossip worked. It started as smoke. Soon it would be fire. Boss Hank said that morning, spitting into the dust as he leaned against the corral fence, "You ever think maybe you don't know who you got working under your roof?" Caleb's eyes narrowed, but his voice was even. "Long as the work gets done, that's all I need to know." Hank smirked, but there was no humor in it. Work's one thing, trust is another. The men shifted uneasily, sensing the edge in their boss's voice. Caleb let the silence stretch until Hank finally pushed away from the fence with a shrug. But Caleb's gut tightened. Hank wasn't finished, not by a long shot. Later that day, the men drove a small herd across the South Range. Dust swirled in choking clouds. Cattle bawled, and the air pulsed with heat. Jessie rode with quiet determination, guiding strays back into line, her movements sharp and efficient. But Caleb saw Hank's eyes on her the whole time, watching too closely, his jaw tight with something more than suspicion. When the herd was finally settled and the men broke for water, Hank sidled close to Jed and another hand. His voice carried just enough for Caleb standing nearby to hear. "Mark me, boys, there's something he ain't tellin'. A man that's secret ain't never just secret, he's hidin'." Jed frowned uneasy. "What you reckon?" Hank's lip curled. "Could be anything. Could be trouble. And when trouble comes, it don't just land on the one who carries it. It lands on all of us." Caleb's voice cracked across the yard before Jed could answer. "Enough!" He stepped forward, his steel-gray gaze pinning Hank in place. "You got something to say, you say it to me, not to the men. You let your tongue wag one more time, and I'll cut you loose, Hank." The silence that followed was sharp as broken glass. The other men looked down, busying themselves with water buckets and tack. Hank spat into the dirt again, but said nothing more. Yet his eyes burned with malice, and Caleb knew he had only poured oil on the fire. That night the ranch yard carried an uneasy quiet. The men sat around the fire, but the laughter was thinner, the stories shorter. Jessie stayed to the shadows, as always, her plate in her lap, eyes fixed on the flames. Caleb watched from the porch, arms folded. The gulf between Jessie and the others had grown wider, and Hank's whispers were the wedge driving it deeper. When most of the men had retired, Caleb found Jessie near the barn, brushing down her horse by lantern light. The quiet rasp of the brush filled the space between them. "You keepin' to yourself won't stop their talk," he said. Jessie looked up. Her eyes shadowed beneath the brim of her hat. "Talk don't scare me." Caleb stepped closer, his voice low. "It should. Out here a rumor can kill faster than a bullet." Her hand stilled on the horse's flank. For a long moment she just stood there, shoulders tight, before finally speaking. "You think I don't know that? Every day I live waiting for someone to look too close. Every day I breathe wondering if today's the day it all burns down." Her voice cracked, then raw but steady. "But I'd rather live with fear than not live at all." Caleb's chest tightened. He wanted to tell her she wasn't alone anymore, that he wouldn't let Hank or anyone else tear her down. But the words caught in his throat. To speak them would be to admit more than he was ready to admit, not just to Jessie, but to himself. Instead, he said quietly, "Keep working. Keep standing. But if Hank pushes too far, he won't be your problem. He'll be mine." Jessie's eyes met his, then sharp and searching. For the first time she nodded, not as a ranch hand to her boss, but as one fighter to another. Outside, the prairie wind carried a low, restless howl promising storms to come. The town of Redemption was small but loud, a cluster of saloons, a mercantile, a church, and too many mouths eager for gossip. It didn't take long for Hank Dobbs's whispers to ride the 6 miles from the Morgan Ranch straight into town, carried by supply wagons and loose tongues. "Caleb Morgan's got a strange one working for him," a store clerk muttered while weighing flour. "Keeps to himself, don't act right." By the time it reached the saloon, the story had grown. "Heard Morgan's taken on a hand, ain't no real hand at all. Some say he's hiding something under those long sleeves. Some say Morgan knows and don't care." And when the gossip reached the far tables where men nursed cheap whiskey and long grudges, the tale twisted again. "They say Morgan's got a woman working his ranch, and she ain't just working." Back at the ranch, Jessie felt the change before she even heard the words. The men's laughter grew sharper when she passed. Conversations ended abruptly when she drew near, and eyes once indifferent now lingered on her heavy with something cruel. One evening, as she carried her plate toward the shadows to eat a younger, Han muttered just loud enough, "Don't sit too close, boys. Might catch whatever secret he's hiding." The laughter that followed was jagged ugly. Jessie froze for a moment, her cheeks burning before lowering her eyes and continuing on. She ate alone back straight, every bite a silent act of defiance. From the porch, Caleb saw it all, his jaw-tightened fists curling at his sides. He wanted to storm over to silence them with the authority he carried like iron, but he also knew pride was a fragile thing. If he shielded her too openly, it would only sharpen the knives aimed at her back. That night, when the fire had burned low and the men drifted to their bunks, Caleb found Jessie by the corral. She leaned against the rail, staring out at the dark sweep of prairie. "They're turning on me," she said quietly before he could speak. Caleb stepped up beside her, his voice steady. "They're turning on their own fear, not you." Jessie gave a bitter laugh. "Makes no difference. Fear cuts just as deep." For a long moment they stood in silence, the prairie wind lifting strands of her hair from beneath the brim of her hat. Caleb glanced at her profile, sharp, proud, but lined with exhaustion. "You think I should leave," she said suddenly. Caleb's jaw worked. The truth was tangled in his chest. Every instinct in him screamed to protect her, to keep her close, to drive back any threat that dared cross her path. But his code, the iron law he'd lived by since Sarah's death, demanded honesty. "You leavin' won't stop the talk," he said finally. "It'll just prove 'em right. And—" he paused, the words rough on his tongue. "This is your fight as much as mine. My land, my men, but you've earned your place here." Jessie turned then, her eyes searching his face, as though trying to decide if she could believe him. Something softened in her expression just for a heartbeat before she turned back to the prairie. The following days were worse. At the branding fire, no one offered Jessie water. At supper, her plate was filled last. Once as she passed by, Hank muttered loud enough for all to hear, "Strange how a man never lets his hat slip, almost like he ain't got nothing to show." The men laughed, some uneasily, some cruelly. Jessie's hand shook as she set her plate down in the shadows. Caleb slammed his cup onto the table, the crack silencing the room. "That's enough," he said, his voice like iron striking stone. His gaze swept the table, hard and unyielding. "Any man who thinks he can mock another on this ranch can ride out at dawn. No pay. No second chance." Silence followed. Then the scrape of chairs as the men bent back to their food chastened. But Caleb saw the way Jessie's shoulders hunched tighter, the way her hands trembled. He had silenced the words, but not the poison. That night alone in her lean-to, Jessie wept quietly into her blanket, the first tears she had allowed herself in years. She had fled one prison only to find another made not of walls but of whispers. But Caleb, standing on his porch staring out into the restless dark, felt something shift inside him. Anger, sharp and dangerous, burned in his chest. Not at Jessie, at the world, at the cruelty that forced her to live a lie. The line he had clung to all his life, order, trust, truth, blurred under the weight of what he now knew. Jessie had lied, yes, but she had also fought, and Caleb Morgan was not a man to turn his back on a fighter. He didn't know yet how, but he would stand between her and every knife aimed at her back. even if it cost him the ranch, even if it cost him his pride. The next morning broke with a blood-red sky, the kind that warned ranchers of storms to come. Caleb Morgan stood on the porch, arms folded across his chest, watching his men file out for the day's work. The rhythm of the ranch still moved forward, horses saddled, cattle-driven tools carried, but beneath it all, the air was brittle, stretched thin by rumor and suspicion. Jessie Hale carried her rope coiled over one shoulder, her hat tugged low as always. She kept to herself, moving with quiet purpose, but Caleb saw the way the men gave her space. Now the way conversations hushed when she passed. She had become an island in their midst. And then Hank Dobbs spoke, his voice just loud enough to carry. "Funny thing, boss. Seems your new hand eats alone, sleeps alone, and keeps to himself like he's got something worth hiding. Ain't right for a man to skulk in shadows." The yard stilled. All eyes flicked to Caleb. He let the silence stretch heavy as iron. Then he said flatly, "Long as he works, he stays. That's all you need to know." A ripple of unease passed through the men. Hank smirked, chewing his tobacco. "Maybe that's all you need, but the rest of us." Caleb stepped down from the porch, his boots grinding into the dirt. "You got something more to say?" "Hank." Hank's grin faded, but he didn't back down. He spat into the dust. "No, sir." The men turned back to their tasks, but the tension lingered like the heat before a lightning strike. Caleb's gaze followed Jessie as she walked toward the south pasture. He had bought her time, but the storm was still coming. That evening, when the herd was settled and supper eaten, Jessie found him by the corral. Her face was pale in the moonlight, her eyes shadowed. "You can't keep doing this," she said quietly. "Defending me. They'll turn on you too." Caleb studied her, his jaw set. "Let 'em." Her voice rose sharp with frustration. "You don't understand. It's not just whispers anymore. They're looking at me different, like they see through me even if they don't know what they're looking at." She sucked in a breath, her hands trembling. "Maybe I should leave." The words struck him harder than he expected. Leave. The thought of her riding away, vanishing back into the wilderness, tore at something deep inside him. "No," he said, firmer than he meant. His eyes locked on hers. "This is your fight as much as mine. You've earned your place here." Jessie searched his face, her expression softening for the briefest moment. "You'd risk your ranch for me?" Caleb's throat tightened. He had spent years living by rules that never bent. Now, standing before this woman who had lied her way into his world, he found himself breaking every one of them. "I'd risk more," he said simply. The silence between them deepened, charged with something neither dared name. For a heartbeat, Jessie looked as though she might step closer, but then she turned sharply, pulling her hat lower. "They'll eat you alive for it." "Then let 'em try." Caleb answered. The next day, the storm inside the ranch grew worse. Hank's whispers had spread beyond the yard. Word had reached redemption twisting in the mouths of townsfolk until it carried a sharper edge. By the time it circled back to the ranch, the story had become something far more dangerous. Caleb Morgan kept a woman hidden among his men, and not just hidden, kept. Jessie felt the weight of it the moment she rode into town for supplies. The stares, the half-smiles, the whispers that followed her down the street like shadows. She hurried her business, pulling her hat low, but the truth was clear. The lie she had worn for safety was no longer a shield. It had become a target. When she returned, Caleb was waiting at the gate. He saw the fear in her eyes before she spoke. "They know," she whispered, his jaw tightened, fury flashing in his steel-gray eyes. "Then let them come." She shook her head, her voice breaking. "You don't get it. Men like Tiller, when they hear Caleb step closer, his voice low and firm. You're under my roof, Jessie, and no man alive will take you from it." The words were more than a promise. They were a vow. But in the distance across the prairie, a trail of dust was already rising, and among that dust rode a man who had once claimed Jessie as his own. The horizon shimmered in the late afternoon heat, a wavering line where earth and sky bled together. Caleb Morgan leaned against the corral fence, his eyes fixed on the trail beyond. He had known it was only a matter of time. The whispers in town, the poison Hank spread among the men, sooner or later they would draw the one man Jessie feared most. Dust rose on the ridge. Not the lazy swirl of cattle, nor the narrow streak of a lone rider, but a wide plume deliberate advancing. Caleb's hand went to the colt on his hip, not out of panic, but out of instinct. A man did not ride with four others unless he meant to make a point. The riders came into view as they crested the ridge. At their head sat a man draped in a black duster that snapped in the hot wind, his hat brim shadowing eyes that glinted with cruel amusement. Grant Tiller. Even from a distance, his presence carried like a bad stench. Behind him trailed four rough-looking men, their rifles slung carelessly, their smirks wide. The ranch hands drifted into the yard tools, set aside their murmurs, carrying unease. Jessie stepped out from the barn stiff as a post, her face pale beneath her hat. Caleb saw the way her breath caught, the way her fingers dug into the worn fabric of her trousers. She had been running from this moment since the night she fled, and now it had come straight to her door. Tiller reined in, hard dust billowing around him as his horse snorted and pawed the dirt. He swung down with theatrical grace, brushing at the dust on his coat, like a man stepping into his own parlor. "Well, well," he drawled, his voice carrying across the yard like oil poured on fire. "If it isn't my runaway bride." Jessie's chin lifted, though her body trembled. Caleb stepped forward, placing himself squarely between her and the man who had haunted her dreams. "She ain't yours," Caleb said, voice low, steady, dangerous. Tiller's sneer widened, his gaze sliding lazily from Caleb to Jessie. "You've done well for yourself, darlin'. Disguising as a boy, working like one of the hands. Quite the performance. Almost had me fooled." His eyes snapped back to Caleb, sharp and mocking. "But you knew, didn't you?" "A man don't keep company with a mystery unless he's in on the secret." A murmur rippled through the hands. Caleb's shoulders stiffened, his jaw set like stone. "She works here. She's under my protection." "Protection," Tiller chuckled darkly. "Or possession. Makes no difference. Either way, she's mine. Always has been." He took a step closer, his hand drifting toward Jessie as though to claim her by sheer will. "Time to come home, Jessie." She flinched not from fear but from fury. The fire in her eyes was bright and raw, a spark that made Caleb's chest tighten. Before he could move, Jessie's hand shot to her side. The Colt she'd hidden beneath her shirt cleared leather faster than most men expected from her slight frame. The shot cracked the air sharp and deafening. Tiller staggered back, clutching his arm as blood blossomed across the sleeve of his duster. His face twisted from smug amusement to raw, stunned rage. His men froze, hands hovering over their weapons, caught between loyalty and shock. The ranch yard was silent save for the ringing echo of the shot. Jessie stood tall, her chest heaving, the Colt steady in her hands. "I ain't yours," she spat, her voice trembling but strong. "Not now, not ever." Caleb's eyes swept the yard, daring Tiller's men to draw. His own gun hovered near his hip, his body a wall between Jessie and the threat. "Get him out of here," he growled to the men standing by. "Take him to the sheriff. He won't be darkening this land again." Tiller's sneer returned, weaker now, but no less venomous. "You'll regret this, Morgan," he hissed, his voice a snake's whisper. But when two of Caleb's men grabbed his good arm and shoved him toward his horse, he didn't fight. The pain had taken the swagger out of him for now. As they hauled him off, Caleb turned back to Jessie. Her Colt slipped from her hands, falling into the dust with a thud. Her body trembled violently, the adrenaline draining all at once. Caleb stepped forward, gripping her hand with steady strength. "You're not alone anymore," he said firmly, his voice carrying across the yard, not just for her, but for every man standing witness. "Not anymore." Jessie looked up at him, then her eyes wide, shining with something more than fear. Relief. Trust. A fragile thread of hope. Caleb held her gaze, his jaw tightening as he realized the vow he had just spoken aloud was one he could never take back. The storm had broken. The ranch, the men, and his own heart would never be the same again. The dust still hung in the air long after Grant Tiller and his riders were gone, a bitter haze that clung to the ranch yard like the aftertaste of poison. The hands dispersed slowly, some muttering to themselves, others exchanging uneasy glances. They had seen Jessie Hale fire a gun like a man and stand her ground like no woman they had ever known. Respect flickered in a few eyes, but in others, suspicion only deepened. Caleb stood beside her, his hand still wrapped around hers as though anchoring her to the earth. Jessie's breath came ragged, her body trembling in the aftermath of what she had done. For weeks, she had lived behind a mask, working in silence, hiding in plain sight. Now the mask was shattered, and there was no putting it back on. "You did what you had to," Caleb said quietly, releasing her hand only when he felt her steady herself. Her eyes searched his face, wide and uncertain. I shot him." "You stopped him," Caleb corrected. "There's a difference." Jessie swallowed hard, her throat bobbing. "They'll never let me stay now." Caleb's gaze swept the yard, his voice loud enough for the men still lingering to hear. "She belongs here. She's earned it. Anyone got a problem with that can pack their things and ride." The words landed like iron. A few men shifted uncomfortably. Jed Young and broad-shouldered gave a quick nod and spat into the dirt as though to mark his loyalty. But Hank Dobbs sneered, his arms crossed tight across his chest. He didn't speak, not yet, but Caleb knew the man's silence was sharper than words. Later, when the yard was quiet and the lamps inside the bunkhouse flickered low, Jessie sat alone on the porch of the main house. Her hat lay beside her, her dark hair braided loosely over one shoulder, catching the lantern light. For the first time, she wasn't hiding behind the brim. Caleb stepped out, the boards creaking beneath his weight. He offered her a tin cup of coffee, and she accepted it with hands that still trembled faintly. "You held your ground," he said, settling into the chair beside her. She gave a weak laugh. "I don't feel like I did." He studied her in the glow of the lantern, the proud line of her jaw, the shadows still lurking in her eyes. "Fear don't mean you're weak, Jessie. It means you're alive. And sometimes being alive is the bravest thing of all." Her lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes dropping to the cup in her hands. "You don't understand. Men like Tiller, they don't stop. He'll come back, or send someone worse." "Then he'll find me waiting," Caleb said simply. She looked at him, then really looked as though searching for any sign of doubt, but there was none. Caleb Morgan had lived his life by a code that bent for no man, and now he had bound her into it. The following days tested that vow. Hank Dobbs grew restless, his mutters sharper, his disapproval heavier. At supper one evening, when Jessie walked through the door without her disguise, the room fell silent. Her dress was plain work-worn, but the sight of her hair braided down her back sent a ripple through the bunkhouse like a stone cast into still water. Jed broke the silence first, offering her a seat and sliding the bread plate her way. "Ain't no shame in hard work," he said simply. A few others nodded in quiet agreement, but Hank slammed his fork onto the table. "This is a man's ranch. Ain't no place for playing house." The words cracked like a whip, and the tension surged again. Caleb rose slowly, his shadow falling long across the table. His voice carried a dangerous calm. "You don't like how I run my ranch." "Hank, you're free to leave." Hank's jaw worked, but he didn't meet Caleb's eyes. He shoved back from the table, muttering curses under his breath. The next morning, his bunk was empty, his few belongings gone. A cloud of dust on the eastern trail was the only sign he'd ever been there. 3 younger hands followed within the week, unable to swallow the shift in order. But the rest stayed. They had seen Jessie work, seen her fight, and slowly the respect began to outweigh the whispers. Jessie, for her part, carried herself with a new kind of dignity. No longer crouched behind shadows, she met the men's eyes, spoke when spoken to, and worked harder than ever. Her hands remained calloused, her muscles strong, but there was a grace in her now, a freedom that made her presence feel less like a question mark and more like an answer. And Caleb watched it all in silence. Watched her rise each morning with the sun, watched her move through the fields with the cattle, watched her laugh quietly with Jed by the corral. A warmth he had thought buried with his wife stirred in him, stubborn and undeniable. One evening, as the last light bled across the prairie, Jessie stood at the fence line, her braid catching fire in the sunset. Caleb joined her, leaning against the rail. "You keep looking out there like you're expecting something," he said. Jessie smiled faintly, her eyes still fixed on the horizon. "I've spent so long running, I don't know how to stand still." Caleb's hand brushed the fence post, his knuckles grazing hers for the briefest moment. "Then maybe it's time you learned." She turned then, her eyes meeting his, and for once she didn't look away. The storm had not passed. Tiller was still out there, and the world was still cruel. But in that fragile moment under the painted sky, both of them felt something shift, something neither of them could deny much longer. The ranch was quieter in the weeks that followed, though not without its scars. Hank Dobbs' departure had left a hollow space in the bunkhouse, one that some of the younger hands whispered about in the dark. But those who remained were the ones who had chosen loyalty over suspicion, and slowly the daily rhythm found its balance again. Jesse Hale, no longer wearing the guise of a boy, moved openly through that rhythm. The first morning she stepped from her lean-to in a simple work dress, the ranch yard stilled. A few men exchanged glances. Jed scratched the back of his neck awkwardly, and one of the younger hands muttered under his breath. But when Jessie picked up her tools and set to work with the same grit she'd shown all along, the silence broke. By evening, she was just Jessie, a woman, yes, but a worker as tireless as any man among them. Caleb Morgan watched the change unfold with quiet pride. The men who stayed learned to nod their respect instead of spitting in the dirt. When Jessie bent her back to mend a fence, they handed her nails without question. When she wrestled a stubborn calf into the branding pen, they laughed and clapped her on the shoulder as they would any hand. Not all moments were smooth. One evening, a young cowhand tried to test her, tossing a heavy feed sack her way with a smirk. Jessie caught it against her chest, nearly staggering under the weight. But instead of stumbling, she shifted her grip, hefted it higher, and carried it across the yard without complaint. She dropped it with a thud at his boots and fixed him with a steady stare. Next time, she said evenly, "You carry it yourself." The boy's face burned red as the others laughed, and after that no one questioned her strength again. Still, there were shadows. At night, Caleb sometimes caught Jessie standing at the edge of the corral, her eyes fixed on the horizon as though expecting Tiller to ride back over it at any moment. The fear was buried, but it was not gone. One evening, Caleb joined her there. The sky was streaked with violet and gold, the first stars winking awake. Jessie's braid glowed in the fading light, her hands resting on the top rail. "You still watching for him?" Caleb asked. Jessie's lips pressed thin. "A man like Tiller don't take kindly to being made a fool of. He'll come back. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next week, but he will." Caleb's jaw tightened. "Then he'll find this ranch ready for him." She looked at him, then her eyes searching, almost desperate. "You'd fight for me." He held her gaze unflinching. "I already have." For a long moment, neither spoke. The air between them was heavy with everything they hadn't said, everything they couldn't yet name. Finally, Jessie dropped her eyes, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "You're a stubborn man, Caleb Morgan." He chuckled low in his chest. "Takes a stubborn woman to see it." Life on the ranch moved forward. Work filled the days, driving cattle, fixing fences, tending to the land. Jessie's presence was no longer the whispered question it had been. It was a fact solid and unshakable. And in small, quiet ways, she began to shed the weight of her old disguise. Her hair, once hidden, now shone in the sun as she worked. Her voice, once hushed and low, carried steady across the corrals. And sometimes rare, fleeting moments, Caleb caught her laughing, the sound light and free, cutting through the heavy air like birdsong. The men noticed too. Respect grew where suspicion had once taken root. Some even sought her advice, acknowledging her skill with horses, her patience with cattle. Slowly, the ranch began to feel less like a battlefield and more like a home. But for Caleb, home had not felt real in years, not since Sarah. The grief that had walled him off, that had made him more stone than flesh, began to crack each time Jesse's eyes found his. He fought it, tried to bury it under work and duty. But the truth was there, gnawing at him with every sunrise. Jesse had become more than just another hand. She was the fire he hadn't known he still carried, the life he hadn't known he could still live. And though the ranch had grown quieter, he knew the peace was fragile. For in the saloons of redemption, Tiller nursed his wounded pride. And a man like him, wounded, humiliated, was far more dangerous than before. The summer sun beat down hard, drying the earth, until cracks split across the prairie like old scars. The Morgan Ranch buzzed with work cattle, driven to the north pastures, hay cut, and hauled horses shod in the blacksmith's lean-to. Through it all, Jesse Hale moved openly now, no longer hiding beneath layers of cloth and silence. She was Jessie, plain and strong, and though some men still looked at her with unease, most had settled into a grudging respect. That morning, Caleb Morgan leaned on the fence rail, watching her wrestle a stubborn colt into the corral. The animal reared and kicked, dust flying, but Jessie's hands were steady on the rope, her voice low and soothing. With surprising patience, she eased the colt down until it stilled, sides heaving. The men clapped a few, letting out whistles. Never seen a hand calm a horse like that, Jed muttered, shaking his head. Caleb's lips twitched, though he didn't smile often. Pride warmed him. Pride he didn't want to show. But it was there nonetheless, burning hotter each time Jessie proved herself. At supper, Jessie joined the men at the long table for the first time. She carried her plate in with quiet dignity, and though the chatter hushed at first, Jed slid over to make space. The others followed, shifting awkwardly but without malice. Jessie sat down, her braid falling over one shoulder, and began to eat. It was a small thing, but to Caleb it felt monumental. The invisible wall that had stood between her and the rest of the ranch was finally crumbling. Later that night, the air cooled and the prairie sky stretched wide stars blazing against the velvet dark. Caleb found Jessie sitting on the porch steps, her knees pulled up, her hands clasped loosely. She looked out across the fields as though she belonged to them, as though the land itself had finally accepted her. "You did good with that colt today," Caleb said, settling into the chair beside her. Jessie's lips curved faintly. "Patience works better than force." "Took me a while to learn that." Caleb chuckled low. "Most men never do." For a moment, silence stretched between them, but it wasn't the uneasy silence of weeks past. It was comfortable, heavy with unspoken things. Jessie tilted her head, studying him in the dim light. "You ever wonder what your wife would think about all this?" The question cut deeper than she knew. Caleb's chest tightened, his jaw working before he finally answered. Sarah was kind. Too kind for this land. She believed in seeing the good in people even when it wasn't easy. Maybe she'd have seen the same in you. Jessie's eyes softened. "You talk about her like she's still here." Caleb nodded slowly. "Feels that way sometimes. Grief's like a ghost, it don't leave when you tell it to." Jessie was quiet for a moment, then said softly, "Maybe ghosts don't always mean to haunt. Maybe they just linger till you're ready to breathe again." Her words settled in him like a seed in dry soil. He hadn't expected comfort, not from her, but it stirred something deep, something that felt dangerously close to hope. In the days that followed, Jessie's presence became part of the fabric of the ranch. She rose with the sun, worked until dusk, laughed sometimes with the men, and sat on the porch with Caleb in the evenings. She was no longer a shadow among them. She was a force steady and undeniable. But peace in the West was always fragile. One afternoon, a supply wagon rattled into the yard from Redemption. The driver, a wiry man with a sharp tongue, hopped down and began unloading sacks of flour and beans. His eyes flicked toward Jessie, lingering longer than Caleb liked. "Word in town says you're keeping a woman disguised as a man," he said with a smirk. "Guess the stories were true after all." The men stiffened. Jessie's face flushed, but she kept her head high, refusing to answer. Caleb stepped forward, his voice cold as steel. "You got supplies to drop, do it. Then you'll ride back to town and keep your mouth shut if you know what's good for you." The driver's smirk faltered under Caleb's stare. He finished his work quickly and left without another word. But the damage was done. The story hadn't died, it had grown, and now even strangers felt bold enough to spit it at their doorstep. That night, Jessie stood by the corral, her arms wrapped tight around herself. Caleb joined her, his presence solid at her side. "They'll never stop talking," she whispered. "Let 'em," Caleb said firmly. "Words don't break a woman like you." Jessie turned, then her eyes shining in the moonlight. "But they can break you. Your ranch. Your name." Caleb's jaw tightened. "I've lost more than a name before. I can stand losing it again. What I can't stand is losing you." The confession hung between them, raw and unguarded. Jessie's breath caught her lips parting, but no words came. The night air carried only the sound of the wind through the grass, whispering promises neither of them had yet dared to make. And far beyond the horizon, in the dim glow of a saloon lamp, Grant Tiller nursed his bandaged arm and his pride. His hatred had not cooled, it had only sharpened, and the storm he carried was rolling back toward them, darker and more dangerous than before. The days settled into a rhythm, but beneath that rhythm ran a current of change, subtle, steady, and impossible to ignore. Jessie Hale no longer moved as a shadow. She walked openly in the sun, her braid shining like a dark ribbon, her dress simple but practical. Where once she kept her voice low, she now spoke with quiet confidence. And the men, though awkward at first, began to accept her as she was. Jed often worked beside her, quick with a joke, sometimes too quick, but his respect was plain. The younger hands, seeing Caleb himself treat Jessie as an equal, followed suit. Even old Bill the farrier, who spoke little and grumbled often, tipped his hat to her one afternoon after she calmed a skittish mare no one else could touch. But for Caleb Morgan, the shift was deeper than acceptance. He found himself listening for her laughter in the yard, glancing toward the bunkhouse each morning to catch the moment she stepped into the light. He'd built his life on silence, on hard rules and harder land, but Jesse stirred something in him he thought long buried. One evening, as the sun dipped low, painting the fields in bronze, Caleb joined her on the porch. She was shelling beans, her fingers moving steadily, her gaze fixed on the horizon. He settled beside her, leaning back against the post. "You've made this place different," he said quietly. Jessie looked up, her brows knitting. "Different how?" Alive Caleb answered after a pause. "For a long time it's been nothing but work and ghosts, but since you came—" He stopped searching for the words. "It feels like there's something worth looking toward again." Her hand stilled on the beans. Slowly she raised her eyes to his, and in them he saw the same flicker he felt in himself. Hesitant, uncertain, but real. "Caleb," she whispered, her voice almost breaking, "I don't know if I deserve that." He shook his head. "You've earned more than you'll ever believe." The silence between them was thick with unspoken things. For a moment it felt as though the world had narrowed to just the two of them, the porch beneath their feet, the prairie breathing around them. Jesse's lips parted as if to speak, but the clatter of hooves shattered the moment. A rider approached from town, dust billowing behind him. It was the supply driver, the wiry man who had smirked too boldly weeks before. He swung down from his horse eyes, darting nervously. "Boss," he said, addressing Caleb, "you'd best know Grant Tiller's been talking loud in redemption. Says he ain't finished with what's his. Says he'll ride for you soon enough." Jesse's face went pale. Her hands trembled around the bowl of beans, a few slipping to the floor. Caleb's jaw tightened, his eyes hard as steel. "Let him talk," Caleb said flatly. The driver shifted uneasily. "It ain't just talk. He's gathering men, drinking heavy, running his mouth. Folks say he means to make an example out of you." Caleb's gaze flicked to Jessie, whose eyes were wide with fear she couldn't hide. He set his hand gently on her arm, grounding her. "Then he'll find me ready," Caleb said. The driver nodded quickly, mounted up and rode off, eager to leave the weight of his message behind. Jessie turned to Caleb, her voice breaking. "You don't know him like I do. He won't stop Caleb. He'd rather burn this ranch to the ground than lose." Caleb's grip tightened on her arm, steady, firm. "Then we'll make our stand here, together." Her breath caught tears shining in her eyes. For weeks she had lived in fear, waiting for the shadow of Tiller to fall over her again. And now with Caleb's vow, she felt something she hadn't dared to in years' hope. Still, fear gnawed at her. That night, long after the men had turned in, she sat awake by the fire, staring into the flames. Caleb joined her, settling into the chair across from her. "You should rest," he said gently. Jessie shook her head. "Can't. Every time I close my eyes, I see him, the way he looked at me, like I was a thing he owned." Caleb's jaw worked, his fists curling at the thought. "You ain't his, not now, not ever." Her eyes lifted to his, shimmering in the firelight. "Then what am I, Caleb? Who am I, if not his?" He leaned forward, his voice rough but steady. "You're Jesse Hale, stronger than most men I've ever known. And you're under my roof, my care. That makes you family to this land, same as me." The words hung in the firelit room, a vow as solid as any Caleb had ever spoken. Jessie's eyes brimmed, and she turned quickly, blinking away the tears, but a fragile smile tugged at her lips, small but real. The storm was coming, they both knew it. But in that moment, beneath the weight of fear and the shadow of danger, something stronger had begun to take root, something that could not be stolen by whispers or even by gunfire. The prairie dawn was cool, the kind of morning that tricked a man into believing the day ahead might be merciful. Caleb Morgan knew better. By noon, the sun would burn the earth raw, and by nightfall, if the rumors from town were true, Grant Tiller's shadow might already be stretching across his land. Still, the ranch had to work. Cattle didn't wait on fear. Horses didn't feed themselves. Caleb rose with the sun, his boots striking the porch boards, his voice carrying through the yard as he barked orders. The men moved with purpose, but beneath their usual rhythm was a tightness, an edge of unease they couldn't hide. Word had reached even the youngest hands Tiller was gathering. Jessie Hale felt it most of all. She moved with steady determination, her braid whipping against her back as she carried water to the troughs, her dress dusty before the morning was half gone. To the men, she looked strong, unyielding. But Caleb, watching her from across the yard, saw the stiffness in her shoulders the way her eyes flicked too often toward the horizon. By midday, the herd was restless dust rising in choking clouds. Jessie rode with Jed and two others pushing strays back into line. The heat shimmered cattle, bawling men shouting, the whole scene alive with noise and sweat. But even in the chaos, Caleb's eyes found her. She rode like she had been born in the saddle, her body leaning with the horse, her rope snapping clean around a calf's neck. For a moment, pride pushed back the weight in his chest. When the herd was finally settled, Caleb called the men in. They gathered by the corral, sweat-streaming shirts clinging. He stood tall, his voice carrying over the dust. "You've all heard the talk," he said flatly. "Grant Tiller's running his mouth in town. Maybe he's gathering, maybe he ain't. But if he comes, he'll find us ready. You work this ranch same as always. And if trouble rides up that trail, you'll look to me. Not rumors, not fear. Me." A murmur of assent rippled through the group. Jed nodded firmly, others followed. The men respected Caleb's word, they always had. But he knew respect alone wouldn't stop bullets. That evening, supper passed quietly. Jessie sat among the men, now no longer apart, though her eyes stayed low, her voice absent. Hank's empty seat still haunted the table, a reminder of the ones who had left rather than adapt. After the meal, Jessie lingered at the sink, washing the tin plates while the others drifted off. Caleb stepped in, drying one with a rough cloth. The small space between them was thick with silence. Finally, Jessie broke it. "Why are you doing this, Caleb?" Her voice was low, tired. "Standing up for me. Risking your ranch, your name. You don't owe me nothing." Caleb set the plate down, turning to face her fully. His eyes, sharp and gray, softened in the lamplight. "Maybe I don't owe you, but I see you. What you've done to survive the strength it took to keep standing when the world wanted you on your knees. That's worth more than any name or ranch." Jessie's hand stilled in the wash water. Slowly, she lifted her gaze, meeting his. "And Sarah, your wife, would she forgive you for risking everything for another woman?" The question cut him deep. He drew a slow breath, his jaw tightening before he spoke. "Sarah's been gone a long time. I thought the part of me that could feel something for someone died with her. But you stirred it back to life. That don't mean I've forgotten her. It means I can finally breathe again." Jessie's eyes shimmered tears. She tried to blink away. For so long she had lived only in flight, in fear, in hiding. And now here stood a man scarred and stubborn, offering her something she hadn't dared to hope for: a place, a future, a hand steady enough to hold her trembling one. She whispered, "You make me feel like I ain't just running anymore." Caleb reached out his calloused hand, brushing lightly against her arm, a gesture both hesitant and sure. "That's 'cause you ain't. Not here, not with me." The words lingered in the quiet kitchen, heavy with promise. Later, as the prairie sky darkened and coyotes yipped in the distance, Caleb stepped onto the porch. Jessie joined him, settling beside him on the steps. The stars stretched wide above, endless and cold. "You know he'll come," Jessie said softly, her voice carrying the weight of certainty. Caleb nodded. "Then let him. We'll be ready." She turned her eyes, searching his face. "You really believe that?" He looked back at her, his gaze steady, his voice like steel. "I believe in you. That's enough." Jessie's breath caught. She didn't answer, but for the first time in years, a small, unguarded smile curved her lips. It lit her face like dawn, fragile but real. Caleb's chest tightened at the sight. Out across the prairie, far from the warmth of the ranch house, a campfire burned in the dark. Around it sat Grant Tiller and the men he had gathered, hard-eyed, armed, and eager. Tiller nursed his arm, his smile cruel. "Morgan thinks he's won," he muttered. "We'll show him what it means to steal from Grant Tiller." The storm was no longer a rumor. It was coming, and the Morgan Ranch would be its battleground. The days leading up to the storm were quiet, but it was the kind of quiet that prickled the skin and made the horses restless. Every man on the Morgan Ranch felt it, even if they didn't speak of it aloud. They worked harder than usual, their eyes flicking often to the horizon, as though expecting to see Tiller and his riders cresting the ridge at any moment. Jessie Hale felt it most of all. At night, she lay awake in her narrow bunk, staring at the shadows on the ceiling. Every creak of the windmill, every rustle of the cottonwoods outside sent her heart racing. She had lived in fear before, but never like this. Not when she had something to lose, not when someone else might suffer for her past. One morning, while hauling water buckets to the corral, Jed caught up to her. He was young, brash, but his eyes were honest. "Jessie?" he said quietly, glancing around to make sure no one else was close. "I just want you to know, I seen what you did that day, standing up to Tiller. You're braver than most men I ever met. Don't matter to me what you was or wasn't before. You're one of us now." Jessie blinked, caught off guard. For weeks she had carried the weight of suspicion like a brand, but here was acceptance plain and steady. "Thank you," she murmured, her throat tightening. Jed tipped his hat, embarrassed by her sincerity, and strode off toward the barn. Jessie stood frozen a moment longer, the smallest thread of hope weaving itself through her chest. Caleb Morgan saw the change too. He saw the way some of the men now nodded to Jessie with respect instead of doubt. But he also knew not all hearts had shifted. A few held to their unease, muttering low when they thought no one listened. Caleb's word kept them in line, but words alone wouldn't hold against bullets. That evening, as the sun bled orange across the horizon, Caleb sat on the porch, sharpening his knife. Jessie joined him, settling onto the top step, her hands folded in her lap. For a long while they sat in silence, the steady rasp of the whetstone filling the space. Finally Jessie spoke. "You keep preparing like a man expectin' war." Caleb's eyes stayed on the blade. "Better to be ready for it than caught asleep." Jessie's voice softened. "And if Tiller rides in with his men, what then?" Caleb looked up, his gaze locking with hers. "Then we stand. Together." Her breath hitched at the certainty in his tone. For so long she had stood alone fighting shadows no one else would face, and now here was a man who spoke of fighting at her side as though it was the most natural thing in the world. The following day brought fresh proof of the danger. A rider from town arrived in a lather, his horse foam-streaked, his face pale. He pulled up hard in the yard, shouting before he'd even dismounted. "Tiller's gathering near a dozen men with him. Drinkin' loadin' rifles, braggin' they'll smoke Morgan out by the week's end." The ranch yard stilled. Tools fell silent, cattle lowed uneasily in the pens. The messenger swung down, his voice shaking. "Folks in Redemption are scared. Sheriff says he can't stop 'em if they ride. Says you'd best be ready." Caleb's jaw tightened, his face carved from stone. He turned to his men, his voice carrying like thunder. "Then we prepare. No man here runs. Not from Tiller, not from anyone." The hands straightened, some nervous but loyal, others grim with resolve. Jessie felt her knees weaken, but she squared her shoulders, forcing steel into her spine. This was her fight, her past come to claim her. She would not run again. That night, as lanterns burned low and the men cleaned their rifles, Jessie stood alone by the corral. Caleb joined her quietly, his shadow stretching long beside hers. "You should have left me back when you found out," she whispered. "Would have spared you all this." Caleb shook his head. "You think I'd send you out to wolves? Not in this lifetime." Her eyes glistened as she turned toward him. "Why, Caleb? Why risk everything for me?" For a long moment he said nothing. The night wind rustled through the grass, the stars wheeled silently above. Then he answered, his voice low, rough with truth. "Because somewhere between all your lies and all your fightin', you reminded me what livin' feels like. And I won't give that up, not to Tiller, not to anyone." Jessie's breath trembled, her lips parting, but no words came. She only stood there, eyes locked with his, the world narrowing to the space between them. And in the distance, faint but certain, came the echo of gunfire, men practicing, preparing. Tiller's men. The storm was no longer just a shadow. It was drawing closer with each day, each hour. The prairie held its breath. For 3 days the horizon stayed quiet, but it was the kind of quiet that pressed against a man's chest and made the nights too long. Caleb Morgan sharpened blades, checked rifles, and drilled his men in silence. Every knock of a hammer, every click of a chamber echoed with the promise of what was coming. Jessie Hale felt it too. She carried water to the corrals, mended torn shirts, baked bread until her hands ached, but nothing chased away the knot of dread in her stomach. She had known Grant Tiller's cruelty better than anyone, and she knew the look in his eyes the last time she saw him. It wasn't just vengeance he wanted. It was possession, humiliation. He would not stop until she was back under his hand or until he was dead. On the fourth day, as dawn painted the sky in blood-colored streaks, the ranch dog growled low at the edge of the yard. The men froze where they stood. Then the sound came distant hoofbeats, faint but steady, like thunder rolling far away. Jed was the first to speak, his voice tight. "They're coming, boss." Caleb stood tall on the porch, his rifle resting easy in his hands, though his eyes were sharp as steel. He scanned the horizon until he saw them tiny black specks growing larger against the morning light. A dozen riders dust billowing behind them, riding hard and fast. "Tiller," Caleb said flatly. The men spread, moving into the positions they'd rehearsed. Rifles checked, horses tied down, gates closed. Jessie stood near the porch, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might break her ribs. Caleb glanced back at her. "You stay inside," he ordered. Jessie shook her head, her braid whipping over her shoulder. "No. I started this fight, Caleb. I won't hide from it." He met her gaze, and for the briefest moment, something like pride flickered in his eyes. But he said no more, only turned back to the dust rising on the trail. The riders swept into view, guns, glinting laughter carrying on the wind. At their head rode Grant Tiller, his arm still bound from the wound Caleb had given him weeks before. His face was twisted in a sneer, his eyes fixed on the ranch house like a hawk on prey. He pulled up just short of the yard, his horse rearing, high dust swirling. His men fanned out behind him, rifles across their saddles, grins sharp as knives. "Well, well," Tiller called, his voice dripping with mockery. "Caleb Morgan and his little brood of ranch hands. And there she is, my runaway filly." Jessie flinched at the sound of his voice, but she held her ground, lifting her chin. Caleb stepped down from the porch, rifle still in hand. "She ain't yours, Tiller," Caleb said evenly. "Not now, not ever again." Tiller's laugh was harsh, carrying across the yard. "You think you can keep what's mine, Morgan? You're a fool. Every man here knows she's nothing but a lie. She'll break you same as she broke me. She didn't break you," Caleb shot back. "She escaped you. That's the difference." The men behind Tiller muttered, some laughing, some shifting uncomfortably. Tiller's smile faltered, rage flickering in his eyes. He jerked his reins, urging his horse a step closer. "You hand her over now, Morgan, and maybe I let you and your boys keep breathing." Caleb raised his rifle slightly, the sun flashing off its barrel. His voice dropped to a deadly calm. "You'll ride off my land, Tiller, or you'll leave in the dirt." The standoff stretched taut as a wire. The ranch yard was silent but for the snorting of horses, the creak of leather, the low whistle of wind through the grass. Jessie's breath came shallow, her fingers clutching the wood of the porch rail until her knuckles whitened. Then Tiller's sneer broke wide. "So be it." He snapped his reins, his horse lunged forward, and in that instant the yard erupted. Rifles cracked, hooves thundered, men shouted. The first bullet hissed past Caleb's ear, splintering wood from the porch post. Jed returned fire, his shot catching one of Tiller's men square in the chest. The rider toppled, dust swallowing him. Jessie screamed, ducking low as gunfire lit the air. Caleb dropped to one knee, firing clean and fast, each shot deliberate. The ranch hands fought like men who knew their land, their cover every angle of the yard. But Tiller's men were hungry, wild, and there were more of them. Jessie crawled toward the doorway, heart hammering, when she saw Tiller himself. He had dismounted, moving through the smoke and dust like a predator, his eyes fixed only on her. Her blood froze. He wasn't here for the ranch. He wasn't here for Caleb. He was here for her. And as his shadow loomed closer, Jessie realized the fight wasn't just for the ranch's survival. It was for her soul. The yard was chaos. Gunfire cracked through the air, horses screamed, and men shouted as dust rose thick enough to choke the lungs. Caleb Morgan fired steady from behind a wagon, his jaw set like stone, his gray eyes scanning for every opening. He hit one rider clean through the shoulder, sent another sprawling from his saddle. But his gaze kept darting toward the porch, where Jessie had vanished, fear pricking him sharper than any bullet. Jessie crouched inside the doorway, the wood splintering around her as stray shots slammed into the ranch house. Her breath came fast, heart slamming against her ribs. She could hear Tiller's voice through the din, low and guttural, closer than it should have been. Jesse, he roared, the sound cutting through the battle like a whip crack. Don't think Morgan can keep you from me. You'll crawl back same as before. The words sliced deep, bringing back nights she had buried, chains she had broken with blood and desperation. For a heartbeat, fear rooted her to the floorboards. Then she forced herself to move. She grabbed Caleb's old revolver from the mantel, where it had sat unused, her hands trembling as she checked the chamber. 5 bullets. Her only chance. Outside, Jed fired from the hayloft, shouting down to Caleb. They're circling, trying to cut us off from the barn. Hold 'em there, Caleb barked, swinging his rifle toward the flank. He caught sight of Jesse at the doorway, his heart seizing. Jesse, stay inside. But it was too late. Grant Tiller emerged from the dust like a phantom, his coat whipping behind him, his eyes locked on Jesse. A pistol gleamed in his hand, but it wasn't aimed at Caleb or Jed. It was aimed at her. You run to him like he can save you. Tiller spat, his teeth bared in a twisted grin. I owned you once. I'll own you again. Jesse lifted the revolver, both hands gripping it tight, though her arms shook. Her voice broke but carried over the din. I ain't yours, Tiller, not anymore. The shot exploded from her hand, deafening, tearing the air apart. Tiller staggered, shock flashing across his face as blood bloomed across his chest. But he didn't fall. Snarling, he lurched forward, his pistol raising even as the wound darkened his shirt. Caleb's rifle barked at that exact instant. The bullet struck true, slamming Tiller back. This time he fell hard, the dust swallowing him as his pistol slipped from his grip. The men behind him faltered. Some fired wild in fury, but others saw their leader's body sprawled and lifeless. Fear broke their charge. Jed shouted from the loft, his rifle spitting, and the ranch hands surged with renewed fire. Within minutes, the tide shifted. 2 of Tiller's men lay dead, 3 more wounded. The rest wheeled their horses, panic ripping through their ranks, and thundered back down the trail, leaving the yard littered with dust and blood. Silence followed, heavy and trembling. Smoke drifted in the air, mingling with the smell of gunpowder. The ranch hands lowered their weapons slowly, eyes wide, breaths ragged. Jessie stood frozen in the doorway, the revolver slipping from her numb hands to the porch floor. Her chest heaved, her braid plastered against her damp neck. She stared at Tiller's body sprawled in the dirt, her past finally motionless. Caleb strode to her, his rifle slung, his hands rough but gentle as he caught her shoulders. You all right? Her lips parted, but no words came. Tears spilled down her cheeks, instead hot and relentless. It's over, she whispered finally. God help me, it's over. Caleb pulled her against him, her sobs muffled against his chest. Around them, the men looked on quietly, some lowering their hats, some nodding with grim respect. The battle had bound them together, but it had also carved something new into the ranch itself, a truth none of them would forget. As the sun broke through the smoke, casting golden light across the battered yard, Jessie lifted her face. Her eyes were swollen, her hands trembling, but her voice carried clear. Thank you for not letting me fight alone. Caleb brushed a strand of hair from her face, his thumb rough against her cheek. You never will again. Not while I'm breathing. The prairie stretched endless and scarred beyond them, but in that moment, Jessie knew she was no longer just surviving. She was free, truly free. And for the first time in years, the sound that broke from her lips was not a cry of fear, but a laugh, shaky, raw, and alive. The ranch had survived, the storm had passed, and in its wake something stronger remained. Your thoughts will help us create meaningful stories. And if you want to hear more powerful healing stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the bell icon so you don't miss any new episodes. And most importantly, share this video with people who need a little hope today. Thank you so much for your time. We hear you, we listen to you, and we are honored to tell these stories for you.